And first of all, I'd like to thank Dr. Smoter for her tireless efforts in providing numerous programs during the pandemic. She has helped and continues to help community members deal with the stress of illness in advocate support groups and Gilda's Club, deal with the stress of trauma in our Trauma Recovery Center, deal with the stress of the pandemic for families at home and returning to school. And she has provided outreach for chambers and local businesses, inclusive of the Museum of Science and Industry, helping their staff decrease the stress of returning to work. So this evening, we are very fortunate to have Dr. Victoria Smoter, who is the lead clinical psychologist at Advocate Christ Medical Center's Trauma Recovery Center. She is also the chief psychology resident at Advocate Christ Medical Center. And Dr. Smoter obtained her doctorate in psychology at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology, and her undergraduate degree in clinical psychology was obtained from Washington College, which is known as the Harvard of the Midwest, by the way. And now she is here to help all of us deal with whatever stress may be hanging on our shoulders. So thank you, Dr. Smoter, and take it away.
Thank you so much, Sue, for that beautiful introduction. Very happy to be here, and I will get my screen shared so everyone can see that there, hopefully without too much interruption on the screen. So tonight we'll be talking about brain health, anxiety, and depression. I do go a little bit into detail with neurophysiology and psychology pieces, just so everybody has that information, but we'll try to keep it high level and leave 15 minutes or so at the end for some discussion. So we'll be talking about the ways that our mental health and physical health are related to one another, talking about the impact of stress, and then some ways that we can build resilience and adaptive coping to mitigate those effects. So mental health and physical health are interconnected. That means our brains and our bodies function together, and they both really do rely on one another for wellness overall. Stress, neurophysiological changes, and external stressors like the pandemic or ongoing things can build up and impact both mental and physical health through changes in both brain chemistry as well as brain structure. And that happens through a lot of different avenues and systems in our bodies, but we're going to focus mostly on what happens with our brain chemicals and our stress response. Depressive symptoms and anxiety symptoms may be the result of stress-induced changes in the brain, and especially if those stress-induced changes go on without being mitigated by adaptive coping skills and resilience building tools, those changes really can become permanent. So sometimes depressive and anxiety symptoms are because of a stressor, and if that stressor is resolved, our brains go back to normal pretty quickly. However, if that stressor or those things that are causing that stress response lasts a long time without having us do something to help our brains and bodies function a little bit better, it can have longer lasting impact, which can become a clinical depression or anxiety type of presentation. So an overview of the stress response, because that is a lot of what we're going to be talking about, and then how to mitigate the stress response. It's important to remember that stress is a normal human response to the environment. It helps us navigate our environment, protects us from threats, and perform necessary survival functions. So having some stress is not only necessary, it's really helpful. So it gives us that extra little boost of adrenaline to do something like a sporting event or a physical activity, or to meet a deadline, or do something even like public speaking. So stress can really help us perform at the top of our game as well. It's important to think about stress as a continuum. We don't go from either not stressed at all to totally stressed out, but we have normal stressors, those day-to-day things that can kind of wear away at us and cause those brief elevations in heart rate or stress response, but they're not necessarily disruptive. And you can think about that like sitting in traffic is a pretty normative stressor, something we don't really like, but doesn't cause a disruption in functioning. that can go into moderate stressors. So something that causes a disruption temporarily. So it's a little bit longer where your heart rate might be elevated. Maybe you're feeling a little bit of worry, or it's something that is a more significant situation. I apologize. My dog is trying to play right now. Ivan, please go away. So those moderate stressors cause a disruption, and you can think about that like a fender bender while sitting in traffic. It's annoying, it causes a disruption, it causes some additional stress response, but it's not necessarily to the point of being overwhelmed or overloaded just on its own. And then we have those extreme stressors that are on the complete opposite end of the spectrum from those day-to-day things. And those are stressors that threaten our well-being, whether it's psychological well-being, our mental health, or our physical health. And that might be a car accident in traffic that even causes injury. So something that is threatening to our sense of safety, whether it's physical safety or psychological safety. And what can happen is with those responses, our survival mode actually gets activated. So that alarm system in our brain that takes stress out of a normal or helpful part of the continuum. So prolonged exposure to stressors, even those normal stressors like day-to-day things like traffic, having a lot of emails, feeling kind of overwhelmed, or being busy at work, or having some conflict in your personal life, those things can add up to have a similar response in our brains and bodies as extreme stressors can. So either one of those things can have really negative effects on our overall functioning and well-being. So for those of you who are familiar with psychology, we love the Yerkes-Dodson curve, which shows that continuum of stress. So on either end, we have those areas that are too much or too little stress, where it's not necessarily helping us to perform survival or even basic activities of daily living functioning. So too little stress, we can be hypoactivated. We can feel bored, have difficulty focusing, even feel kind of apathetic or down because we don't have enough of that adrenaline and epinephrine in our system activated to really get us motivated to be engaged. We might move from that into slightly understimulated, feeling a little bit unfocused, but generally functional, kind of mellow, but not necessarily at the top of our game or peak performance, which is our optimal stress level, where there's enough stress to keep you engaged, to keep you vigilant, to keep you performing your tasks, whether it's at work, at home, in relationships, physical activity, those things. And then pretty quickly towards that optimal level of stress, we can get into too much, where the stress is starting to build up. You may be feeling tense, on edge, or feeling a little bit preoccupied or unavailable, kind of what I just looked like when my dog was trying to play with me. So those things where you have something on your mind or something that's kind of in the periphery. And then we get into too much stress, which is that red on the other level of panic, anxiety, anger, frustration, burnout, depression, or apathy, and even maybe some trauma symptoms as well, depending on what is causing too much stress. So it might be a single event thing like getting in a car accident that threatens physical or psychological safety, or ongoing stressors that can cause us to feel kind of checked out. And we'll talk about what that looks like in a little bit. So stress is impactful. Even when we're managing it relatively well, it can have an impact on us. So stressful situations, immediate stressors like those car accidents, or like acute stressors, and prolonged exposure to stress have an impact on each person, although it might look different for different people, and it might look different depending on what adaptive coping skills you either have as protective factors or additional risk factors or stressors that you're having. And here's where we get really technical. So we have an alarm system in our brain, and that's our lizard brain. It sits back here by our brainstem, and that is our alarm system. When the alarm system gets activated by stress, or if we're feeling threatened, there's an increase in the stress hormone cortisol, which activates our HPA axis. You do not need to remember this, but it's the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis that is our fire alarm. It is the fight, flight, freeze response that gets set off so that that stress response totally takes over in those moments. Your heart rate increases. You might notice that your breathing can become a little bit more shallow. And what happens is all of our energy goes towards dealing with the stress, dealing with the perceived threat. And that reduces brain activity in areas of the brain responsible for emotional regulation. So things like mood, executive functioning, so judgment and reasoning, and cognitive functioning. So memory and concentration can also be impacted. And that can happen with one of those really acute, immediate stressors, like a car accident, where you feel it all at once. That can also happen over time, where there's a cortisol buildup in our system that still activates the HPA axis and reduces other areas of brain functioning. It takes all of that energy and resources away from that. Addressing stress early and developing proactive ways to manage stress helps improve overall wellness and reduce the negative impact of stress, even prolonged stress or those really immediate acute stressors. So I wanted to just put in a note about traumatic stress. That is also what we call toxic stress. But trauma or toxic stress results from an event or series of events or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening and has lasting adverse effects on different areas of well-being and functioning. Traumatic stress is a response to an event or events that can cause significant or prolonged stress responses in our bodies and brains. So when that HPA axis, when that alarm system is activated and it's not turned off immediately, or it doesn't necessarily turn off at the end of that situation. Prolonged traumatic stress does not always come from a single event trauma, like a car accident, but can also be experienced from repeated or prolonged events or circumstances, like sitting in traffic every day during the week on your way to and from work, on top of feeling busy at work, on top of maybe not having a conflict with a friend or a family member. So it can be a lot of things that build up to that toxic or traumatic stress response as well. And a note on the collective stress response, which is something that we are all a part of in some way right now. The collective stress response is what we call the normative responses to an abnormal situation or set of circumstances impacting a large group, community, or global population. COVID-19 is a collective stress event in that we're all impacted by the pandemic in different ways and may have different responses. However, it is still a stress experience for each of us, even if we're not necessarily feeling continually overwhelmed, anxious, angry, down, or disrupted by the pandemic. It is still something that collectively is a stress event for our entire community and global population. So who experiences toxic stress? Anyone can experience traumas and toxic stress response. Again, not only from single events or big T traumas like those car accidents, but collective trauma and prolonged exposure to toxic stress can also have significant impact. Although a note, there is a disproportionate impact of toxic stress response and collective trauma in communities of color, low socioeconomic status communities, as well as first responders and frontline providers in disaster and emergency situations. So those are individual groups where we tend to see more of the functional and negative impact of those prolonged stress and global or collective stress events. Okay, so now we've talked about that foundation of stress response, how it activates the alarm system in our brain, and we'll talk more about those brain changes in a little bit here. But we've talked a little bit about where stress can come from, how it can impact, where stress can come from, the impact it has on our brain systems, and now we'll talk about what that looks like. So stress can look like physiological or physical symptoms like change in sleep, change in appetite, increased heart rate, or even on the other end of that, really extensive panic symptoms or even panic attacks. Psychological or emotional symptoms, feeling down, angry, or numb, increased irritability or increased worry, so an increase in depression and anxiety symptoms, and then changes in behaviors or relationships. And when we see changes in behaviors and relationships, social behavior, what can also happen is that reinforces the psychological or emotional symptoms of stress. If we're feeling isolated because of, being overwhelmed, being tired, being fatigued, we're not sleeping well, we don't really want to be around people, so we isolate from our friends and family members, it can actually exacerbate and contribute to feeling even more down. So we want to be mindful of how these things all work together in these different categories and taking kind of a self-check when we go through these symptoms in the next couple of slides, so that you can come up with a plan for resilience building and self-care that really fits you and those specific things that maybe are fitting you or are fitting other people that you know. So some indicators of a maladaptive or toxic stress response, or maybe being on the beginnings of those in that yellow area of our Yerkes-Dodson curve, going back to the beginning. Feeling tired or worn down, even if you get sleep. So feeling like you can't get enough sleep, you're not getting restful sleep, or just feeling fatigued and kind of spent overall. An increase in irritability or frustration, feeling like you have a shorter fuse when that's not really a normal response for you. Increase in worry or feelings of uncertainty. So worrying a lot about too many different things, having racing thoughts that feel out of control, or really trying to think through planning for events that haven't happened yet, going to that worst case scenario even. Isolation or reduced social engagement, sleep disturbance, whether it's sleeping too much, so hyposomnia, not sleeping enough, not getting good sleep, having nightmares, or really just restless sleep overall. And that includes vivid dreaming. Sometimes a stress response may be an increase in vivid dreams or a change in dream content, even if it's not necessarily a nightmare. So having those dreams that feel so hyper realistic that it's hard to separate if it really happened for those first couple minutes when you wake up in the morning. Dreading going to work or having trouble getting motivated to complete tasks, whether it's at work or at home, is also an indicator of that emotional fatigue or that mental fatigue, and kind of a shutdown of the parts of our brain that are responsible for planning and executing tasks. Intrusive thoughts or excessive worry about what if situations, feeling disconnected, down, or emotionally numb. So sometimes it does look like feeling kind of sad, kind of overwhelmed. Other times it can look like not really feeling too much or just being on autopilot, being kind of checked out in that way. Feeling an overwhelming sense of responsibility or even an overwhelming sense of apathy. So I have to do everything, I have to fix everything, I have to control everything, I have to handle everything, or there's so much to do, I'm not gonna be able to do it all, so I might as well not do anything. And those are really opposite ends of the spectrum, but both are indicators of a toxic stress response, or even some of those beginning clinical presentations of an anxiety or a depressive episode. Difficulty concentrating is a really common one that we see. Change in appetite, whether it's eating more or eating less, not finding that food just really doesn't sound appealing or taste good, or like nothing feels really satisfying, including GI upset as well. Physical aches and pains, when we are having a stress response or an ongoing response where our HPA access and that alarm system and survival mode is activated, what happens is our muscles tend to tense up more to be ready for action. And that can cause an increase in physical aches, pains, muscle tension, maybe noticing more stiffness in joints, in your neck, shoulders, jaw, wherever you tend to hold stress. You might experience a loss of interest in things that you used to enjoy or find meaningful. So not really finding the motivation to do things that outside of that time maybe would have been really exciting to you, really interesting to you. And that may even be like having difficulty focusing on watching a TV show that you like, following a series, reading a book, loss of interest in even doing things like calling a friend or a family member to catch up because it feels like a lot of energy even. And then we also tend to see behaviorally change in routine and habits. So when we're feeling overwhelmed, one of the first things that goes for a lot of people is self-care behaviors. So things like eating healthy, nutritious meals, or making sure to take some additional time for a personal care routine, whether that's doing a little bit of journaling, mindfulness, meditation, taking an extra 15 minutes to sleep in, or an extra walk around the block, whatever it is. We also see an increase in maladaptive coping strategies. A lot of times when we get really stressed out and fatigued, because we're looking for that quick like surge of a brain chemical called dopamine that lights up our reward pathways. So sometimes when we're feeling really stressed out and we want to just eat a Big Mac or go to Taco Bell, it's because our brain is not accessing its dopaminergic pathways that help us to feel happier. It's our reward pathway. And then when we eat something really salty, really fatty, or really sweet, whatever it is, our body has a reaction to that. It releases that dopamine in our brains. We feel happier momentarily, but it's not necessarily an adaptive coping mechanism if that's what we turn to every single time. Okay, so now we've talked about what stress looks like, how we might notice that. Now let's talk about the way that it impacts our brain health and how we can do things to impact our brain plasticity, our brain's resilience, and also our overall physical and psychological wellness through some resiliency practices. So when we have that HPA axis activated and we are releasing increased levels of cortisol, that stress hormone, what happens is our brain goes through different structural and connection changes, and we have a lot of different things happening on a physiological level. Again, please do not commit any of this to memory. It's a lot of information. The big key takeaways I'll sum up when we get through all of the more dense content. So when we are living in a state of prolonged stress response, when we have that cortisol, when we have a lot of that activation, our brain can actually shrink. And the areas where it shrinks are hippocampus, related to memory, our prefrontal cortex, so all of this area up here, which is related to executive functioning like emotional management, judgment, insight, making logical decisions, even rational memory. And our cortex actually can shrink as well, which means we have less brain mass, which means we're losing structure and connection. So if you think about our survival part, the survival part of our brain, that alarm system, while the amygdala and the HPA axis is really in the middle of your brain, it's kicked off by our lizard brain here in the back, which is the exact opposite end of the places that get shut down and experience shrinkage first. When we have a lot of that activation and cortisol increases inflammation in our entire bodies. So you might have additional immuno responses. It reduces our immune system. You might have increased joint pain, aches, inflammatory symptoms, those types of things as well. And our brain is an organ, so it also experiences an increase in inflammation as stress hormones increase. So what happens when our brain is inflamed and swollen and not so happy is we have decreased brain chemical function, and we can experience changes in memory, mood, and sleep. The decreased brain chemical neurotransmitter functioning is important because basically all of the good feelings that we have come from serotonin, which is found in our brain as well as our GI system, and dopamine, which is, like I said, that reward chemical, the thing that makes us feel really good when we do something like exercise, eat something we enjoy, spend time with people we love, those types of things. And then oxytocin and other endorphins, which are those natural things that make you feel good. Endorphins make you happy. Endorphins help you stay connected. Endorphins sustain relationships and those things. So when we see a decrease in those functions or the functioning of those chemicals, what can happen is we swing too far to the other side where we get emotional changes, cognitive changes, and changes in mood and sleep as well. When we are really stressed out, we also can experience oxygen restriction in our brains. Again, we have less structural and connection activity in our brains during that time, so less things oxygenating our brains. The reason why that part is important is because over time, when we have oxygen restriction to our brains, it can change, it can contribute to shrinkage in the cortex, which over time can result in structural changes that are more likely to contribute to long-term mental health problems, cognitive problems, and memory problems. And there are even studies linking that to early onset of Alzheimer's or development of Alzheimer's-like symptoms and dementia symptoms in individuals when there is really prolonged stress for a long period of time. I want to be mindful that is extensive stress for extensive periods without adding adaptive coping skills and resilience things. So no worries, there's hope there. Even if you are stressed out for a long time, it doesn't necessarily mean that you are doing irreparable damage. Again, structural and connection changes, less activity in reward pathways, increased activation in the part of your brain responsible for fear and reactivity. We see cognitive changes, so we are less likely to remember things in our short-term and remote memory, difficulty concentrating and attending to things, having that brain fog type feeling like, did I send that email or did I only think about sending that email kinds of moments. And we also experience emotional changes. When our fear and reactivity center of the brain is activated and the feel-good reward pathways are less active, what can happen is we experience less positive emotions, have more difficulty accessing happy or positive memories, and go more towards those fear-based or anxious memories. And we have changes in positive appraisal, meaning it's harder for us to think about the good or to see the good in situations actually like on a neurological level over time. Key takeaways. When we have really long periods of stress activation with increased stress hormones in our body, it causes brain changes that impact memory, sleep, mood, cognitive functioning, and overall emotional functioning. So even if it's not what we would call an organic depression or anxiety episode or disorder on its own, what can happen is prolonged stress can lead to depressive and anxious symptoms, which can in turn become, without intervention, a more clinical presentation of a mood or anxiety disorder. Takes a lot. A lot of people don't get there even under large stressors. So, this is not meant to provoke any fear or anxiety or increased stress. Just talking through the way that those different systems all function together. So this is just a graphic that I like to use. When we are activated, increased stress, we can have a sense of doom, panic attacks, depression symptoms, so chronic anxiety and stress increase your risk of depression, like we talked about, headaches from constant worry, irritability, breathing problems, so feeling like you can't get a good deep breath in, increased heart rate, loss of libido, upset stomach. So it really is a good graphic, I think, in my opinion, of the way that our brains and bodies work together and how those things are interconnected. So it's not only one thing that's impacted by our brain health, it's also all of these other things because everything is connected by the HPA axis and by our neurotransmitters, those brain chemicals that regulate functioning. Okay, connection to anxiety and depression. Now that we've talked about all the really heavy neuropsych stuff, mood regulation has a meaningful relationship to both physical and neurological health. Over time, factors that contribute to those neuropsychological changes, poor sleep, poor nutrition, inflammation, those things can impact anxiety and mood regulation through those changes in brain chemicals and functioning in brain structures. That also means, on the flip side, getting good sleep, getting good nutrition, staying hydrated, and doing things that reduce cortisol levels and increase endorphins and those happiness chemicals we talked about, those things have the opposite effect. So stress response can become a longer-term mental health concerns if not addressed, or stressors do not spontaneously remit, or if you don't have protective factors already in place. And most of us really do. So most of us are already really resilient, and we'll talk about some things that we can do to increase resilience as well. Big takeaway, taking care of physical and mental health work together for overall resilience and well-being, a healthy brain, a healthy body, and feeling as positive and resilient as possible. So the good news is that we are resilient. Our brains and bodies have the capacity to adapt to long-term stress and heal from stress and toxic stress events. Our brain is continually changing in response to the environment. So if we find ways to build in practices that build resilience, the brain can actually undo many stress-induced changes. And we'll talk about what some of those look like. The big ones are, through well-documented research, are mindfulness practices, exercise, good nutrition, adequate sleep, and healthy social interactions. And none of those things need to be done in really large chunks of time. It's about taking the intention to do something good for yourself, to stay in the moment, get some physical movement in, take care of your body's physical needs by staying hydrated and getting some micro and macronutrients in, getting sleep as much as possible, and staying connected. Gratitude is also really connected to resilience. And gratitude does not mean toxic positivity or optimism. We're talking about finding something that is meaningful or pleasurable despite stressful situations. Gratitude is a positive emotion that is experienced when people perceive that they have received a valued benefit. Oftentimes that is an emotional benefit more than like a cognitive or a monetary benefit. Research has linked gratitude with various indices of well-being, including decreased depression, increased positive life appraisals, positive affect, perceived meaning in life, and increase in overall life satisfaction. A grateful mindset is also more likely to encourage help-seeking behavior, both people reaching out to you for help and you reaching out to others for help and support when necessary. Expressions of gratitude also help in building and sustaining long-term relationships, dealing with adversity, and bouncing back from stressful situations with strength and motivation. The connection between gratitude and happiness, and I could talk about this all day, but I want to make sure we have time for questions, is multidimensional. Expressing gratitude to others and to ourselves induces positive emotions, primarily happiness. By producing feelings of pleasure and contentment, it impacts our overall health and well-being by reducing those stress hormones and helping us feel good. So even when we think about something that we're happy about, something that is meaningful to us, something that we find cute or just enjoyable, thinking about sunshine, sitting outside in the sun, looking at a flower, looking at a loved one, thinking about going on a trip, or accessing a positive memory, what happens is we have areas in our brain that are related to pleasure and reward that light up even when we're thinking about that thing. You don't have to be doing it to get the cognitive and the neurological benefit of thinking about it. Gratitude is also positively correlated to more energy and enthusiasm to work harder and stay motivated and engaged in your day-to-day things. And it helps us connect with meaning and purpose. So gratitude is really huge, and we'll talk about that in these strategies. So some ways to manage the stress response and build in these resilience practices. Seeking support from family members, friends, coworkers, faith-based support, even behavioral health support if needed. Staying socially connected is really important. Focus on what is within your control, especially if you're noticing some of those excessive worries or difficulty controlling worrisome thoughts. Being able to say to your brain, I've done what I can for this situation. There's nothing else for me to do right now for this that is within my control, can help our brain put down a worry and take a little bit of a break from it. Identify positive things happening in the world or make a plan to look forward to safely. Again, gratitude. Gratitude is huge. We're going to keep talking about it. Take care of your physical health by staying hydrated, getting some physical movement in to release some endorphins. Exercise releases endorphins, and endorphins make you happy. And stay nourished in terms of the food intake. I'm not saying don't ever eat junk food. I'm a big supporter of, having a junk food day or days. That's something that fits in your way of eating, but making sure that you are taking care of your basic physical needs through nutrition as well. Disconnect from the media to give yourself a little bit of a break, including social media. Sometimes we can get bombarded by so much information. It's really difficult not to feel overwhelmed. So giving yourself permission to tune out, maybe to not stay totally up to date on all of the news all the time, or disengage from social media if it's causing you stress. Practice relaxation and mindfulness techniques. We'll talk through some of those in the next slide. So engage your parasympathetic nervous system, your body's relaxation center to combat stress response. And you can do that with deep breathing and muscle relaxation, as well as mindfulness and some of these other pieces we'll talk about in a minute here. And then know the signs of when it's time to seek professional support services, when it might be helpful to have somebody else guide you through a self-care or adaptive coping plan. And that's something that, again, is a normal response to abnormal situations. Ongoing stressors, we didn't evolve to know how to manage that. So our brains don't know what to do when we're feeling constantly overwhelmed. Sometimes it's helpful to have an outside opinion to help, or opinion, an outside person to help you walk through and build in a self-care plan that really fits you. So some coping strategies. Practice mindfulness and relaxation interventions regularly. It doesn't have to be long. Mindfulness does not have to mean meditation. Mindfulness is being present and aware of what's going on in the here and now. It's engaging your thoughts, your breathing, and your body. And if you engage two of those things, The other one is going to fall into line. For those of you who practice yoga, that's one of the tenets of yoga. But really taking time to be present, focused, check in on what you're doing, and be aware, mindful of the here and now, what you feel in your body, what you're noticing in your thoughts, and getting some breath work in. Relaxation interventions might be even muscle relaxation, doing some deep breathing. And deep breathing is really great because it helps combat stress on a physical level as well as a cognitive level. You don't have to do it for that long to get a big benefit from it. Even spending 90 seconds 5 times throughout the day, so about, can't do math, about 7.5, 8 minutes of deep breathing a day helps reduce your blood pressure. It can help with your resting heart rate. It can help with inflammation, and it can help with cortisol levels. So checking in with deep breathing tells your brain, I'm safe. I don't need to react to a threat right now, because it's the exact opposite of how we breathe when there is something we have to run away from. The 3 M's of coping are really huge as well. Meeting, moving, and making. Meeting is maintaining social connection. Find a safe way. And I know as the vaccines come out and all of those good things, we're getting one more step closer to some semblance of normalcy, but stay safe in these things as well. But, spending time, making time to spend time with loved ones, family members, friends, FaceTime, stay connected on the phone, whatever you need to do to feel that type of meaningful social connection. Moving, get some physical activity in. It doesn't have to be 90 minutes of an intensive workout. You don't have to run a marathon or anything. Get some stretching in. If you sit all day, taking a couple of minutes to relieve the tension in your hip flexors and your low back by doing a little bit of recovery stretching, or taking a walk around the block now that the weather is getting nicer, anything that fits your lifestyle and feels good to you, but getting some physical activity in. When we start moving, we keep moving, that releases more endorphins and helps us to regulate stress levels. There's a lot of research that suggests for mild to moderate levels of depression and anxiety, good nutrition, good sleep, and getting some moderate exercise in can have a really significant impact, even to the point of having the same efficacy as some medications. So it doesn't work for everybody, but it does help our brain bounce back from stress response. And then making is anything concrete, doing something that is a creative outlet, something from start to finish. If you're not creative, it doesn't have to be something that is like an art project or painting or anything like that, but even cooking a meal and seeing something through from start to end. When we feel overwhelmed, it can sometimes feel like things just keep piling up. So it's nice to do something that has a concrete outcome. Keep a routine as much as possible. That reduces decisional fatigue and helps free up basically mental space for other decisions. So if you know that you have a routine, your brain knows what to expect, you can put more of that mental energy towards other things, like intentionally practicing some self-compassion and compassion for others. That's important because when we are stressed out, when we are feeling more down, when we are feeling more anxious, we are less likely to be kind and patient with ourselves. And how we talk to ourselves continues to impact mood and responses to things. We're also less likely to have that little bit of extra patience and compassion for other people if we're feeling already really keyed up and on edge. So taking that time to take a deep breath, tell yourself to stop before you have that response as much as possible, and ask yourself, am I responding to myself? Am I responding to this person? Or am I responding to overall feeling tired, feeling hungry, feeling overwhelmed, whatever it is? Take time to find the good. I told you we'd keep talking about gratitude. If you can find 2 or 3 things a day that are not bad, that are pleasurable, that are meaningful, that excite you, that you're looking forward to, even thinking back on a good memory. And if you jot those down, what happens is over time, you have an subjective objective, but you have a concrete data log of things that are meaningful, important, and nice that you can go back to, even if you can't think of anything for that day. And then focus on what you can control. We talked about that a little bit in the last slide. It's really important though, when we are overwhelmed, when we are feeling down, when we are feeling anxious, it can sometimes feel like everything is so big and so overwhelming. So focus on those baby steps. What can I do right now? What can I have change with right now? I can choose to empty my dishwasher and check that off my to-do list. And that makes you feel a little bit more productive, helps you take time to find the good, practice gratitude towards yourself and say, I could have not done that and I did it anyway. Even if I really didn't want to, it feels better to have it done and I'm proud of myself. Sounds silly, really helps. Some helpful relaxation strategies that you can include: deep breathing, really big. When we are breathing with our diaphragm, it tells our brain we are in a place that we can relax, that we are not in a place that there's any threat to us. And if you are having difficulty engaging your diaphragm, you can even just practice slowing down your breathing. When we slow down our breathing, our heart rate slows to match our breathing rate. And that again tells our brain that we are in a place that we can slow down and we can relax. If you are counting your inhales and your exhales, there's also no room in your brain to have thoughts that are contributing to anxiety or distress. So one way that I really enjoy doing this, actually, because it's simple and anyone can do it, to slow down your breathing, it's called one nostril breathing. You want to make an L with your fingers, and you're going to hold one nostril and breathe in. And then at the top, switch your fingers and exhale fully through the other nostril. Slows down your breathing rate really quickly. Do that for 90 seconds. You're going to notice a drop in heart rate as well to a more relaxed pace if you're starting to feel really activated. Guided imagery or mindfulness meditation, for those of you that works for, is great. Again, it gives us those little mini mental vacations. Keeping a gratitude journal, we just talked about it, really big, highly recommended. It doesn't have to be anything that feels Pollyanna or, too overly optimistic, but finding those things that are good, finding those things that are positive, and finding those things that have meaning, even when things are really big and overwhelming. Setting time aside for yourself with intention. It doesn't matter how much time it is. The more time, the better, honestly. However, if you have 10 minutes, take that 10 minutes for you. That is you time. If it's spending 10 minutes in the car before you, walk into your home at the end of the day to listen to some music, to finish that podcast, to do whatever it is that you need to do for you, but setting time aside for yourself with intention. Recovery stretching and yoga, really good for muscle tension, aches and pains. You can find a lot of great free resources for that on YouTube. I will say, if you have any physical health conditions, ailments, aches, pains, those things, please consult a physician before starting any new exercise or any intensive exercise program. Just, make sure you listen to your body. And then listening to music, podcasts, journaling, doing something that you find helps you to relax. Those are just some ideas. It doesn't have to be relaxing music. Sometimes even listening to angry music is something that helps people blow off steam. So whatever it is that works for you. These are just some options. It's not a mandate. So some tips on when to maybe consider seeking professional support. That doesn't necessarily mean therapy, but that outside person who can help you build in some adaptive coping and resilience building measures. If you're noticing significant impairment in functioning at work, home, or relationships, feeling anxious, down, angry, or disconnected most of the day or nearly every day, loss of interest in things you used to enjoy, or difficulty doing things at all, sleep disturbance or panic symptoms to the extent that you're having difficulty functioning in other areas because of sleep deprivation or feeling really keyed up or really worried, really fearful, feelings of helplessness or hopelessness, or anytime there's just the desire for additional emotional support or stress management tips. A lot of people, I will say, if you have good social support, if you are working on doing resilience things resilience building activities and coping skills with intention, a lot of people won't necessarily get to that point of clinical disruption. However, if that does come up, if any of these things do come up, or if you do want professional or that higher level of support and care, please remember that is a normal response to prolonged stress. It is the way that our brains and bodies respond, because our brains and bodies did not evolve to deal with the level of stimuli, the level of information, the level of things that we have bombarding us every single day. And sometimes our brains just need a little bit of a reset to get back on track in terms of where they need to be. Okay, so a quick note on my place of work, the Advocate Trauma Recovery Center. We are fully grant funded by the Victim of Crime Act and on a state level, the Illinois Criminal Justice Information Authority. We provide trauma-informed behavioral health services to survivors of recent intentional violence or family members of homicide victims at no cost. We serve ages 4 and up in 8 counties, so basically the Chicagoland area now, and we provide individual therapy, group therapy, psychiatric medication management, social services, and referral services for up to 16 sessions, and at no cost to survivors. If you have any questions about us, or if you would like to refer to us, or think that we might be helpful in some type of partnership, please feel free to reach out. And my contact information is all over the place. So is the Advocate Trauma Recovery Center, but I'm happy to answer any questions about that as well. Great. So we have about 10 minutes left for questions. I'm going to stop slide sharing so that I can see people if there are questions. Okay. I know that's a lot of information.
Go ahead, Anne Marie, do you want to unmute yourself? I can see you raising your hand, yeah. Hang on 1 second, let me go ahead and unmute. Yeah.
Dr. Smoder, thank you so much for your presentation. What I wanted to know is, do you have any information on the post-concussion syndrome, like a contra coup brain injury, followed by repeat concussions, which I guess is called the post-concussive syndrome?
Yep, so post-concussive syndrome can actually have a lot of the same kinds of impact in our cognitive functioning and our memories as a stress response. So what happens is when we have inflammation in the brain in those different areas, we can have difficulty with concentrating, difficulty with sensory perception, and some of those pieces. What I will say is post-concussive syndrome is really something that you want to be working with a medical doctor with as well, because it is something that physiologically has kind of a trajectory for people. Our brains are interesting things. We can't always guess what's going to happen after a traumatic brain injury. However, there's usually a trajectory for post-concussive syndrome and post-concussive symptoms of when somebody's like vision, if it's disruptive, or if they're getting headaches or sleep disturbances or mood changes, how that can kind of shift too.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, some relaxation stuff helps with those same symptoms though, because it helps our brain kind of retune itself.
So all that you said about the stress things would be very helpful for that.
Ideally, yes. Again, medically speaking, I can't make any kinds of guesses about how somebody's physical brain structure, but anytime that we can help our body and our brain along in a healing process, we're putting ourselves in a good position. And that's something we do a lot with behavioral health as well, is help to manage stress levels so that our physical body can do what it needs to do and take over. But reduction in inflammation and cortisol overall is really useful.
Okay, thank you.
And I think the only question we had in the chat was about the slides being available, or so far. Would that be possible to send those and I could email them to the registrants?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
Oh, thank you.
And then we just have one more question come in too, or there was a comment. Thank you, Dr. Smoder, for all the information you provided, very helpful. And then one more question here. How would you recommend speaking to someone who is apprehensive to getting help for their stress?
Excellent question. We talk about that a lot with the Together Respond Peer Support Program. When you come from a place of compassion and not a place of judgment, it is easier for people to hear some of this. It's not saying you need therapy, you need professional help. It's saying, you know, there might be some things that will help you to manage a different way. I'm noticing some changes, and I wonder if there might be some ways that you can manage your stress level a little bit differently, or you can address some of this anxiety or some of this mood stuff a little bit differently. And sometimes it helps to talk to somebody outside of the situation for that reason.
Dr. Smoner, I'd like to say thank you so much for letting us know of so many great coping mechanisms. And question in regards to serotonin in our GI system. Are there foods that we eat that would help our or that would increase our serotonin? So what is the connection between brain health and the diet or our nutrition?
Of course. So actually about 70% of our serotonin comes from our gut. So having a healthy gut and a healthy digestive system is really important for mood regulation. When our GI system is out of kilter, and that looks a little bit different for everybody in terms of the way of eating, what your how your body responds to different things, different tolerance levels, and so on and so forth. But having a healthy gut helps us have a healthy mood. It regulates sleep, it regulates mood management, it regulates even emotional connection. So really taking care of your digestive system, making sure you're getting in like fiber, protein, healthy fats, leafy greens, generally like the recommended nutrition if that fits your way of eating, but there's not necessarily a specific food. There are some studies that link also different omega 3, 6, 9 stuff to increase serotonin and gut health, but really just making sure you are eating well, whatever eating well looks like to you.
Awesome. And what is the correlation between stress and disease?
So stress increases inflammation. Inflammation increases instances of a lot of different physical health concerns. So higher blood pressure, it can have an increase in, chronic headaches, chronic pain response and perception of pain. Inflammation can reduce our immune response, so our immune system's response to things. So we're more susceptible to illness, and then chronic stress and that chronic inflammation is linked to things like rheumatoid arthritis, fibromyalgia, joint pain, diabetes. I mean, it goes on, chronic heart disease and cardiovascular disease. If you think about when we're really activated, our heart has to work harder. So when we are constantly activated, we're like running the motor all the time. And that impacts brain health. Alzheimer's is something, and dementia symptoms are things that are related to chronic stress levels as well. So overall, it's inflammation. If you think about it, inflammation is almost never good. It doesn't help us heal. It doesn't help keep our organs healthy. So when we have activated, when our stress system is consistently activated, we are kind of consistently pumping our bodies full of inflammatory hormones and chemicals.
Thank you. Very, very excellent. An abundance of excellent information. Thank you.
Again, it's a lot. So there's a lot of really great information out there about the link between psychological wellness, so taking care of stress, not sitting in that toxic stress response, and physical health.
And I think it's also important just to hear this often and realize that these are things we need to be reminded of, because in our culture, we tend to fall off the healthy balance quite often. So I think just hearing this and getting back on track again is very helpful. So thank you very much.
Sure thing. I would say if you have any really specific questions about physical health related to stress, anxiety, depression, mood, those things, consult with a medical physician, because we never want to say that something is because of a stress response or something is because of a disruption in mood or an increase in worry if we haven't ruled out physical causes and any underlying physical or medical conditions first. So, a big piece of stress management is taking care of your physical health. And part of that is working in collaboration with the appropriate specialist, whether it's a psychologist, a social worker, medical GP, whatever it is, to know what's going on.
All right, I think that is all of the questions that came in. Thank you so much, Dr. Smoder, for your wonderful presentation. And thank you, Sue, for putting this together. And everybody, thank you all for being here today. And we will hopefully get the slides out to you guys in the next few days, so you can take a look at some of those wonderful techniques that were mentioned.
And feel free, when you get the slides, if you have any questions, you can always shoot me an email. It might take me 3 days or so to get back to you, but I will get back to you.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good night.